bright idea. You brew all the root beer, we'll pick your coconuts for you. Thus, exchange is born, you see. Now, the basis, the question that comes to you, obviously, is how much root beer will exchange for a coconut in this first act of exchange? And the answer is going to be that if it takes you half an hour to pick a coconut and half an hour to brew half a pint of root beer, then half a pint of root beer is going to exchange for one coconut. Because if the bloke who produces the root beer tries to rip you off, or if the man picking the coconuts tries to rip you off, then you can just pick your own coconuts or brew your own root beer. And that is not very different from an example that Adam Smith used about people trading deer and beaver, where he said that in one of the first pages of his book, The Wealth of Nations, that if it takes an hour to trap a deer and 2 hours to catch a beaver, then the natural rate of exchange is 2 deer equals 1 beaver. And again, the idea is that if the geezer exchanging deer tries to rip you off, you say, sod it, I'm going to get my own deer instead, and it'll only take half the time that he's trying to exchange it for. Now, I'm trying to get you back to the basics of it, but obviously there are 1 or 2 complications compared with this primitive state of society that we're looking at. First of all, in terms of picking coconuts with ladders, you have to allow not only the time it takes you to shin up and boom, pick your coconut, but also the time it takes you to make a ladder. And in effect, on the depreciation on the ladder. And so, if you're talking about real commodities, they divide into 3 parts. The first part is that they divide into what Marx called constant capital. So you're going to have to try and work out what is the depreciation on a ladder. Because time spent making a ladder is just the same as time spent climbing up the ladder and picking the coconuts. You've got to include the 2 to get a realistic picture of how much time you're actually devoting to that activity. But secondly, in a class-divided society, there is one difference. These people own their own means of production. Although they're exchanging, they are simple commodity producers who exchange their commodities among themselves. You have laid claim to this coconut tree. You have appropriated the twigs and the stuff to make the ladder. They're yours. Nobody can rip you off. The difference with capitalism, obviously, is that they own the means of production, and that therefore we have to work for them. Now, we work for them at what we call a subsistence. Obviously, the subsistence that workers get in the 21st century in an advanced capitalist country is very different from what they got at the time of Charles Dickens. We know that. We're not stupid. We know that the working class has made gains. We're quite proud of the fact, actually, that we're not just being shoved around like Tiny Tim and these sort of people in Dickens stories. It's an advance on the part of the working class. But we haven't got enough that we can just buzz off and retire. If you could go in for 5 years and make enough money that you could run off and buy shares and then sit around and wait for the dividends to pop in, then everyone would try and do it. Now think about it. If everyone was able to do that, it would not happen, because dividends would not plop through people's letterboxes if there's nobody actually in those factories and workplaces making the stuff. Because, okay, capitalism is different these days from Dickens' time. You don't have capitalists owning the mill and with big top hats and that kind of thing. People own shares. When you say capitalists own the means of production, you mean they own pieces of paper that entitle them to a share of other people's work. That's what owning the means of production means in the 21st century. So those are the 3 parts that a commodity is divided into. But it is important to just do this basics of labour value. One of the first people who criticised Marx from the standpoint of bourgeois economics was a bloke called Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk. an Austrian economist. And he didn't have a problem that you could exchange the labour of a tailor who made a coat with the labour of spinners and weavers who made 20 yards of linen. But he said, well, what I would need to know is how much for how much. Now, frankly, that is ridiculous. What Marx is saying is this, that there is a miracle taking place here. The labour of a tailor is qualitatively different from the labour of spinners and weavers. There's different skill, they're different people, they're doing completely different tasks. And yet you don't blink. None of us blink when that happens. But this is the central mystery of the capitalist system, actually, is that we're actually part of a huge division of labour. We don't recognise we're part of that division of labour. And we just sort of take it for granted that, oh, well, you know, we can exchange these things. But it is mysterious. And von Bohm-Bawerk was saying, well, the problem is, how can you prove that X amount of the labour of a tailor is equal to Y amount of labour of spinners and weavers? And it's a bit like, I don't know how many people are familiar with Catholic theology, but it's a bit like, you know, the bread and the wine turn into the body and blood of Jesus Christ in the communion. And you say, no, I don't have a problem with that at all. I find that entirely plausible. What I need to know is how much body, how much blood. And that is ridiculous, isn't it? If you accept that completely different types of labour are exchangeable, then you're accepting that there's something the same about them. And that is that they are products not of the labour of a tailor and the labour of a spinner or a weaver, but that these people are part of a huge division of labour, and in fact there's a pool of what Marx called abstract labour, which is being divided up, not in a conscious way. Nobody's saying, you do this, you do the washing. Nobody says that under the washing up. Nobody says that under capitalism, but nevertheless you are imposed into a division of labour. And that's what happens to you. Okay, now get back to money. Money starts off with this isolated act of exchange. When you're saying 20 yards of linen equals one coat, you're using one of those commodities to measure the other. You're using it, in fact, as the first form of money. Money is an equivalent. It's a universal equivalent. It's a universal equivalent for practical reasons. It's a universal equivalent because it arises out of the exchange process, and it acquires that because of these various handy things about it. You can divide it up into discrete lumps that represent certain amounts of values. Everyone will accept it after a certain period of time. So it's a universal equivalent. It's a measure of values. We don't measure value in terms of labour time. No, look, this is a pretty simple thing. What did it cost? 30 or 40 pence, this biro? This biro is mainly made out of plastic. That plastic is mainly oil-based, as I understand it. That oil comes out of the North Sea. I've never seen one of these things, but I understand that the derricks in the North Sea are twice the size of St Paul's Cathedral. A very small amount of the depreciation of one of those derricks contributes something towards the value of this. How much? We can't possibly know. And in any case, why do we need to know? It's absolutely pointless. We're not actually saying, oh, there's X hours of labour in there and Y hours of labour in that. We're saying that, oh yeah, that's worth twice as much as that because there is twice as much labour in it. Why do houses cost more than fish and chips? Well, you probably work that out for yourself because it takes much more work to build a house than it does to acquire fish and chips. Why does a box of matches cost less than fish and chips? Well, because let's face it, it's not very elaborate. There's not a lot of labour that goes into the production of a box of matches. So that is the role that money plays in exchanging commodities in the capitalist system. But it plays another role, and I think you're all going to be here tomorrow, and that is in relation to a means of payment. In other words, so far we've dealt with exchange. You go into the marketplace, you're a candlestick maker. Somebody buys your candlesticks, you get money. You run off to the bakers or the butchers. And all these exchanges take place at the same time. But of course that doesn't have to take place at all. The other role that money takes is the role of a means of payment. You borrow money you haven't got. We've all done this, I'm sure. You borrow money you haven't got, you spend it for present gratification, and you get the bill comes whomping on your doorstep a bit later on. So I'm not really, unless you want to do a lot about this, to discuss the actual intricacies of the financial system, because it is a whole subject in itself. But the final thing is that I started off with commodity money because I think it's important that you understand that money did begin as commodity money. But of course it's not commodity money now. If you can go in the Bank of England and wave a £5 note at them and half a gold sovereigns and they'll just laugh at you. Of course once that connection has been broken, then if they send out twice as many £5 notes as they did before, then each £5 note is only going to be worth half as much. And you are going to get an inflation taking place. Does that mean that we are monetarists in the sense that Milton Friedman and these people were? Not really. Milton Friedman was a bloke who actually wrote Monetary History of the World. You know, everything in the world happened because of the way the money supply was being manipulated, as if it was just a matter of these authorities who are either benign Friedman supporters or malignant Keynesians and other dodgy sort of characters like that were in charge of the money supply, and that is totally ridiculous. I mean, what we are saying is that when you've got an inflation like you did in the 1970s, which was over 20% a year at one time, at some stage that is because the government is increasing the money supply. But it's not just because the government is evil or they're stupid and short-sighted, it's because the economy has hit real problems. And what we have to do in a situation like that, and it does look like inflation might be coming onto the agenda once again, is to actually look at what those forces are that causes capitalism to come into problems, which in turn leads to there being an excess emission of money. But the main thing to notice is that all these people who talk about money, all the neoclassical economists, whether they're Keynesians or they're Friedmanites and fairly hard right sort of characters that run the show these days, they all try and present money as being neutral. In neoclassical economics, money is said to be a veil. You know, all you do is you lift the veil and you see these commodities actually moving around among themselves. All that money's doing is hiding what's basically a barter economy. It's not basically a barter economy. You know, money is not neutral. Money plays a role in politics, and people like Milton Friedman were profoundly political people. He went over to Chile after the defeat of Allende. He probably didn't actually put electrodes on people's genitals himself, but he did know that went on. I mean, the Chicago boys did know that went on, and their economic shock treatment was part and parcel of a defeat of the working class movement, which took place in Chile at that time. And it was profoundly, monetarism was a profoundly political movement. It was a right-wing reactionary movement against the overmighty strength of the working class, as people like Friedman saw it. So I'll leave it there.